Howdy my totalies, always Tubular Gamers are back with, you guessed it, yes, I know you guessed it, another video. Now for today's video, I really wanted to talk about some independent games. I talked about some of the best indie games about a month ago and realized that I just don't give enough love to indie games. I'm mostly focusing on big AAA games these days, so this video is going to try to rectify that. I actually love indie games, it's hard not to. If you want to find new games that are full of soul and passion, look no further than indie games. I've quickly realized that a lot of my favorite experiences in gaming over the last decade have actually been with indie games, where they weren't made with some astronomical budget or a massive team. These indie games were created by small passionate teams, or in some cases just one person. So today we're celebrating those indie games. I got 12 indie games for you that I would personally give a 10 out of 10 to. Now as a reminder, 10 out of 10 means something different to everybody. To me, a 10 out of 10 is not a perfect game. A perfect game does not exist. I could point out a flaw, negative, issue, pain point, etc. with all of these games. A 10 out of 10 just means that I can give it my highest recommendation. I think these are all must-play titles. If you breathe air, then I'm going to recommend these games to you. And for these 12 games, yes, they really all are 10 out of 10 experiences for me. Despite that, I'm going to say that I'm really just scratching the surface of indie games with these 12 games. There is a whole ocean of indie games that I've never even heard of. I'm not afraid to admit it, I am not as well versed in indie games as I am with double or AAA games, so I'd love some recommendations down below. Please let me know some must-play titles that I might not have on here. I'm always lurking in the comments, especially when I'm not working a 9 to 5, so let's get a discussion going. Tell me about your favorites and let me know what videos you'd like to see in the future. Alright, this intro's gone on long enough, so please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. If you made it to this part of the video, you rule. Let's get to the games. So the first game I wanted to bring up today is Vampire Survivors. This game is easily one of the most addicting games that I've ever played and one of my favorite games of the 2020s in general, and I feel like I've barely even mentioned it. Released in 2022, Vampire Survivors is a roguelike shoot 'em up, but with this huge twist. The twist being is that the game is a reverse bullet hell where you get to play as the boss who's making all of the projectiles, and all of the enemies are trying to just even get to you. Your character attacks automatically, and as you defeat enemies you collect gems. Once you collect enough of these gems, you level up, and when you do, you can add a new weapon to your build or a perk. The weapons and perks given to you are pretty much random, and once you die you'll have to start over from scratch. You'll find yourself quickly leveling up though, and within a few minutes you'll go from shooting one tiny little projectile out at a time to sending dozens of projectiles out every few seconds, and then you can combine them with some of the perks and you can become even more powerful. It really doesn't end there though. You learn about these combinations where certain perks go with certain weapons to make weapons even stronger, or new weapons entirely. And before you know it, you are just this unstoppable force of nature where you are just creating constant scream nukes and throwing so much shit out at once that you can barely even see what's going on. But you know you are wrecking everything in sight, and it's just so satisfying. The game is a total blast. Just annihilating everything on screen never gets old. As you play more and more, you unlock new characters which have their own weapons. There's a few different maps to play on. It's just one of those games that I could spend a stupid amount of time with, and I have. I have played way too much of this game and find myself still coming back to it even after I've already beaten it. It's just ridiculously enjoyable and entertaining. It's also more on the casual side, and I say that is a good thing. You really only need to move your character around and confirm things on menus, and that's it. You could easily play the game with just one hand, and I found myself just getting kind of obsessed with this game, especially the first time I played it. It was all I wanted to play, and when I was closing my eyes, I was seeing the gems and hearing the noises in my daily life. Maybe I do have some issues. And if this wasn't enough, there are several DLCs for the game as well, and these DLCs are incredible, crossing over with Among Us, Contra, and even Castlevania. The Castlevania crossover in particular is crazy since the game is created low-key from Castlevania assets, but I love how the game looks, and it has nice music as well. The game is available on everything, including phones. It's just one of those experiences that I really cannot recommend enough. It's also dirt cheap. At full price, the game is like $5. If you're looking for one of the most addicting video games ever, here it is. So the next game we have here is one of the more well-known indie titles, and that is Cuphead. I remember when this game first got announced and everyone was blown away by the art style, and then after several delays it finally came out in 2017 and it was just as good as everyone had hoped it would be. But this game is actually way more than just its art style and aesthetic. Obviously, yes, the game looks absolutely incredible all these years later. It really does look like the cartoons it's inspired by from the 30s, and I would say it's one of the best looking games of the 2010s. Everything is just so full of life. All of the animation is nothing short of delightful and the colors really pop. I also like how the game is pretty grainy with its filters, and the soundtrack is unironically one of the best game soundtracks of the 2010s. But outside of the amazing graphics and music, you have a great run and gun shooter here, one of the very best ever. You can play by yourself or with a buddy, and the game sees you essentially going on a boss rush through 3 different worlds as you collect souls for the devil to pay off a gambling debt. While there are levels without bosses, a vast majority of the levels are boss fights, and this game has some of the best boss fights of any video game. They are all wildly different from each other, they all have their own unique identity and gimmick, and they all put up a challenge. In order to beat them, you'll have to learn all of their attacks, patterns, strategies, and really understand your character's moveset. Every boss also has several phases that can be like wildly different from the last. It can feel like you actually have to beat a few bosses in one go. As you play through the game, you can unlock some new moves and attacks that further mix up your strategies, but even with this is one tough game. Don't let the art style fool you. This is one of the hardest games that I've ever beaten, but it's also one of the most rewarding. Struggling for minutes on end just to try to even make it to the next phase of the boss only to get wiped out immediately will never not be crushing. But when you're finally able to beat that boss, man, that shit feels so good, and that's what this game is all about. Struggling and trying over and over until you're finally able to overcome a difficult boss. There's even some replayability here with these tokens. The game's got a pretty good length to it, the pacing is really solid, it's constantly keeping things more interesting, and if you're looking for even more content, there was a DLC released. And that DLC adds a whole nother island, and that island is arguably the most difficult part of the entire game. It's more difficult than the rest of the game, at least in my opinion, but it might be even more rewarding when you finally beat it. The game controls incredibly well, it looks amazing, it's fun, and it's immensely rewarding. Cuphead really is a one-of-a-kind game that I think everybody should try. So the third game we have here is Hollow Knight. Now, I still haven't actually finished this one all the way through, but I have been playing it, and all I gotta say is this game is absolutely incredible. I had heard amazing things about it for a very long time, but it just took me forever to finally get to it, and man, I wish I got to this one sooner. So Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania, but it's not just a Metroidvania. It is the Metroidvania. It is so good. It is everything you were looking for if you like this genre, or if you've ever wanted to get into this type of genre and didn't play, a Metroid or Castlevania game. The game just drops you into this huge map where you're free to explore to your heart's content, and there's plenty to see of in this game, and as you play through the game, you unlock more and more abilities, and those new abilities unlock new areas in previously discovered areas, so you end up going back and finding even more secrets in areas, but Hollow Knight just does it in a way that feels different from most Metroidvanias. The level design is superb, and the game has a great sense of exploration. You will want to explore everywhere, you'll want to see everything, and this game is just absolutely massive. This might be like the biggest Metroidvania I've ever seen. If you think Animal Well or The Lost Crown are big, you gotta see this game. Outside of the exploration and basic puzzle solving, there is combat in this game. The combat is pretty good. It can also be rather challenging at times. It's not Cuphead hard, but it'll give you a run for its money. The game also has a lot of replayability to it as well, and I can just say that this game, at least so far, has been a really unforgettable experience. It also has a nice art style to it. I really love all the contrasting colors. This is one that I really gotta make some more time for and finish it before Silksong finally does release. I know people have been waiting forever for the sequel, and I don't know why, but I just feel like it's finally going to come sooner than later at this point. I hope it does. People are going to lose their mind over it, and it's not hard to see why. It's because this first game is just brilliant through and through. I really can't recommend it enough. So the next game we have here is one that I love talking about, and that is Bomb Rush Cyberpunk. I knew from the moment I saw it that this game was going to be something that I was going to love. I love Jet Set Radio and its sequel, but it's also been like 20 years since the last game, and we've never really had much else like it. Sure, there's been imitators like Hover, but nothing has ever even come close to Jet Set's quality until Bomb Rush showed up. This game is just freaking phenomenal, and it's everything I ever could have wanted from a game of this style. Not only does it recreate the Jet Jet Set gameplay, but it improves on it, modernizes it a little, but it actually enhances it. The story's pretty simple. It's about your ragtag graffiti gang going up against the man, but there actually is a little bit more to this story. I'm not going to act like it's anywhere near as memorable or iconic as its source material, but I enjoyed it for what it was. But when it comes to the actual gameplay, it's great fun. It's very similar to Jet Set Radio. It's a 3D platformer with some extreme sports elements. Most of the game is platforming, jumping from one area to the next, grinding on basically everything that you possibly can, and of course tagging as much as possible. You can even do tricks and get a big burst of speed, and I gotta say the trick system and controls in general are way better than anything Jet Set ever had. What those games had was good, but this feels great. It feels really nice and responsive. The platforming is very well done, the level design is actually made for this. The trick system, while basic, is still more than what Jet Set had. There is a little bit of combat, and like the source material, it's pretty weak, but it's not awful, and the combat is pretty minimal in this game. This game really was just an absolute blast through and through. They also totally nailed the aesthetic, vibe, and atmosphere of Jet Set as well. I love how this game looks. I really like how polygonal it is, and it just has some killer vibes. They really nailed the mood, and especially the soundtrack. Oh, it is so good. It's probably not as good as Jet Set's, but shit, this is really good straight up. I know I've compared this game to Jet Set a lot, but I just want to take a step back and say, this is a great video game regardless of its inspiration. And even if you have no idea what a Jet Set even is, I think you're going to enjoy the game. It feels amazing, it has vibes that cannot be beat, and it's just a whole lot of fun. It was one of my favorites in 2023, and I can confidently say it's one of my favorite indie games of all time now. So here we have a game that I feel like I could talk a lot more about no matter what the context is, and that is Disco Elysium. This game, man, this game goes so hard. It is one of the greatest role-playing games ever made. I know that might sound a little bit like an exaggeration or a pretty bold statement, but if you've played this game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's just never really been anything else like it. Sure, it is inspired by several other games, but it comes together in a way that I feel like has just never been done before or since. The game sees you playing as a detective with amnesia, and you're investigating some murders, but there is so much more going on here besides that. And all I gotta say is the story, the writing, the characters, that dialogue, the world building, it is all just superb in this game. It is so well done, it's memorable, it's funny, it's entertaining, there's a lot going on, there's a lot of depth with every single character, and there's so many great interactions between characters. The writing is just exceptional in this game, and is some of the best you'll find from any indie game. Actually, scratch that, just any game in general. I would argue like every single piece of dialogue in this game is actually well written, and it's a good thing because this is a very narrative focused game. The story, the mystery, and your interactions really are everything. The actual moment to moment gameplay is pretty basic. You're walking around in these areas, investigating everything, examining things, talking to characters, and then you're getting skill checks, and the skill checks are a dice roll. When you start the game, you really build out your character, and I'll just say the way you build them out will affect the rest of the game. Like, no exaggeration, the way you build your character in the first hour will affect the last hour of the game as well. And you are given dozens upon dozens of choices to make throughout the game, and you can get a lot of different scenarios, completely different endings, and a lot of crazy shit can happen. This game has just a ton of replayability. And I know a few people that have played through this game several times and gotten just a bunch of different outcomes in a lot of different scenarios. The choices you make and all of the skill checks really are the gameplay at its core. There's no combat, there's no battles. It's all about these skill checks. And I'm not just talking about like a basic dialogue check. I'm talking to like even just examine some stuff. A majority of the interactions you have with the world in general are skill checks. And I think the game does a great way of addressing this. And you don't have to pass all of these. You won't pass all of these. It's just not possible. You can't have a super build like that, but part of the fun is failing these skill checks and seeing what happens. And there's just never been a game like it. Something else that's really unique about Disco is how it looks and the soundtrack. I really like the art style. It goes for something pretty different, and then the soundtrack, ooh, it is really well done. I very much enjoy the soundtrack of this game. Disco Elysium is a game that I just can't recommend enough, especially if you like role-playing games. And it doesn't matter what type of role-playing game either. I think you're gonna like this game. At the very least, you'll find it pretty funny. So here we have a game from 2020, and that game is Animal Well. I've hyped up this game quite a lot recently, but I will continue to hype it up since it really was just made by one dude, and it's one of the best Metroidvanias ever. But is it better than Hollow Knight? You can be the judge of that one, but I don't think anybody can deny this game's quality. Seeing you play as this blob thing just dropped in this world, you'll find yourself exploring this mysterious, vast area. There's no combat here, and it really is all about the exploration and secrets, and I will say this game has one of the best senses of exploration that I have ever seen in a video game. You will want to uncover everything you possibly can. Every single screen has at least one secret to it. Things aren't always what they seem, and this game does a great job at rewarding you. As you play through the game, you'll unlock new abilities, and these new abilities unlock new areas of the map to discover, and then a bunch of new secrets show up, and it just never gets old. The game has a really unique atmosphere, and I like how it looks. While it is rather simplistic, it gives off a certain charm and vibe to it that I was just eating up. This is one of those games where I only expected to play a few hours of it, but as I was playing it, I just found myself get so invested I ended up playing through pretty much the entire game in one sitting. I just found it incredibly engrossing, and all I wanted to do was explore everything. Like, I just wanted to see as much as possible. If you're somebody who likes this genre or you like exploring things in video games, I think this one is worth checking out. I could talk about it for a few more minutes, but I really don't want to spoil anything at this point. It's one of those games where I think you should go in pretty much completely blind. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next game. So the next game is a game that I have not yapped on and on and on about, at least not yet, and that is Stardew Valley. Now, I'm not the biggest farming game guy. I haven't played all the Harvest Moon or Rune Factory games, but I like farming games from time to time. But there is no farming game that is better, in my opinion, than Stardew Valley. This really is just a complete package, and it's one of the greatest indie games of all time. It was pretty much all made by just one person as well. It's incredibly impressive. The game is no hyperbole here, one of the most beloved indie games of all time, and it's really not hard to see why. It's just a wonderful farming game. Even if you're somebody who doesn't even like farming games, I think you can still like this one. Sure, it is a lot slower paced and you aren't fighting all that is evil and you're not trying to save the world, but it still provides endless hours of entertainment. There's plenty of farming, some dungeon crawling, fishing, and even relationship building. There's actually some really memorable characters. There's a lot of great dialogue and interactions as well. There's also a lot of secrets. The game goes on for quite a long time, and the seasons are actually very different from each other. There's just a lot to see in this game. There's also a lot of replayability. You can start new games and have completely different scenarios show up, and it's all very relaxing. This is just such a calming, relaxing game. Every single time I play it, I love the vibes, and while the art style and music might be a little basic, it just hits differently. The game can be played cooperatively, and there's been dozens upon dozens of updates over the years. I just don't think that there's ever been a farming game that is as good as Stardew Valley. Like, you would be really hard pressed to find any farming game that is better than Stardew Valley. Even the most beloved Harvest Moon games, I don't think are as good as this. It's just one of those games that I really can recommend to everybody. Even if this is so far out of your comfort zone, it's not even a blip on your radar. I still think you can enjoy the game, and if you're not into it, if you're not digging it, play it with someone else. Playing it with somebody else makes it a lot more enjoyable. This really is one of the all-time greats when it comes to independent video games. So our next game is Hotline Miami, and while I know this one is getting up there in age, it did come out over 10 years ago now, it still is one of the best indie games of all time. I remember when it came out, it was making all the headlines. Indie games were nowhere near as common as they are nowadays, so it stood out even more. But here we are 10 plus years later, and I think the game is still amazing. Sure, there have been plenty of imitators since then, and there's even a sequel to this game, but nothing beats the original Hotline Miami in my opinion. The story and premise were just so weird, where you played as this character named Jacket who would go and get a phone call every single day to go take out some, I'll just say, interesting folk. But it turns out there's a lot more to this story to uncover, and I think all these years later, the story of Hotline Miami is actually pretty good, and there's a really good mystery here as well. Something else that resonated with me all these years later was the aesthetic, the vibe, and especially the music. I love the chill colors, tone, and general saturation the game has. I also like the pixel graphics, but then the music comes in and oh ho ho, let me tell you, the music is just absolutely phenomenal. This really is one of the best soundtracks of any game. I know I've been really glazing the soundtracks of these games, but I'm gonna just tell you, out of all the games I'm talking about today, Hotline Miami's OST might be the best, but when it comes to the actual gameplay, it really is like peak top-down gameplay where it's very fast-paced and it sees you just running into every building, killing everything in sight. Everything dies in one hit, yourself included, so you have to play pretty cautiously, but it also leads to some really frantic scenarios where you're just scrambling to kill everybody and hoping that they aren't able to land a shot off on you. The game can actually get pretty challenging, especially towards the end of the game, when a few enemies that don't die in one hit show up, but I also think it's incredibly rewarding. Finally being able to overcome a difficult room feels really great, even all these years later, and while the game can at times feel a little repetitive since it is just you massacring everything in sight, basically every single level, the pacing is well done and the game is short enough that it doesn't become stale. This is another one of those experiences that is just low-key unforgettable, and I'll never forget just how much fun I had the first time I played through it, or the second. I've actually replayed this one a few times, it's that good. If you haven't played it after all these years, I really can't recommend it enough. At least listen to the soundtrack. So from Hotline Miami to Angerfoot, I've been making comparisons between these two games for months now, but it feels great to finally have them back to back in the same video. Angerfoot is actually very similar to Hotline Miami, it's just from a first person perspective, and it's arguably even crazier than Hotline Miami. It sees you playing as the titular Angerfoot, a really mad dude who loves a nice new pair of sneakers, but one day all of his sneakers get stolen, so it's up to him to get all of them back, and along the way you kick a lot of people. The moment-to-moment gameplay is incredibly fast-paced, and it will see you killing absolutely everything in sight. Like Hotline Miami, it's lights out real quick. You die in pretty much one shot, leading to some very frantic encounters. But you have your secret weapon, your angry feet. You get to just absolutely kick the shit out of everything in this game, and the kicking feels so good. You're kicking doors down, you're kicking fools left and right, you're kicking projectiles back. The kicking feels phenomenal in this game. It is immensely satisfying, and it's hilarious thanks to the physics. Seeing enemies go flying from your kicks will never not get old. You do get guns to help as well, ranging from shotguns to submachine guns and even a crossbow, but you'll still be kicking everybody. The levels are all very short, and you'll probably be replaying through them a few times each to figure out where all of the enemies are while not totally getting owned in seconds. While the game is challenging and there is some trial and error, it is nowhere near as difficult as Hotline Miami, but I also found it to be just as much fun as Hotline Miami. Something that really adds to the fun factor is that the music is completely synced up to the game, so when the action starts getting intense, the music really ramps up and it creates these moments where everything clicks and you just feel completely unstoppable. The music is also really good, so that certainly helps. I like the game's aesthetic, and it just has this really aggressive attitude to it that I really resonate with, especially as I get older. While I know that this game is not everybody's cup of tea, I have no problem recommending it to anybody that is looking for a crazy fun time. So the next game we have here is a real banger. We have the game Hades. This is the fourth game by Supermassive Games, and it's arguably their best. Hades is a hack-and-slash roguelike that is, without a shadow of doubt in my mind, one of the greatest roguelikes ever made. I know that might sound like a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but roguelikes really don't get much better than this. The story of this game is pretty simple. It sees you playing as Zagreus, the son of Hades, as he attempts to escape from the underworld to reach Mount Olympus. But like many of the other games I've talked about today, there is a lot more going on with this plot. I actually quite like the story and the world building of Hades. There's a lot of good characters here, and there's a lot of great interactions with these characters. They're all likable, they're interesting, and they also provide something different, especially compared to plenty of other games that happen to feature Greek gods. But when it comes to the moment-to-moment gameplay, it is an action RPG hack-and-slash roguelike with some very satisfying combat. At the beginning of the game you only have a sword, but you quickly can get a bunch of other weapons. And all of these weapons actually feel not only really nice, but different from each other. It really changes up how you actually play the game, which is pretty cool. And you'll be going through the underworld several times if you want to see everything. All of the runs are going to be pretty different in this game. There's a number of different factors here, from the items you'll pick up to the enemies you'll fight. Even the bosses can be a little different, and of course there's a bunch of unique interactions along the way. What I'm trying to say here is that the game is incredibly replayable. One run will take you upwards of 40 minutes to maybe an hour, but you'll be doing so many runs in this game, it's not even funny. It is just one of the most replayable games ever. Something else that helps the game is the art style and the music. Love how this game looks. It does have a pretty unique art style and aesthetic, and then the music, ooh, I think it's also pretty good. I feel like I've said the music is good for like every game I've talked about today, but man, we've just got some banger soundtracks here. Hades is not a game you want to miss. It's challenging, fast-paced, frantic, but it's also really fun. It's immensely satisfying when you finally are able to complete your first run, and it's just as satisfying when you complete your 10th run. This game is just always awesome, and I'll always have no problem recommending it. Alright, so the next game we have here is a real favorite of mine, and that is Cult of the Lamb. I remember there was quite a bit of hype for this one, but I feel like a few years later now it has died out a little, and you know what? I'm not going to let that happen. I'm always going to hype this game up because it was actually a whole lot of fun. As the title implies, it sees you running a cult. You play as a lamb, and you'll really have to manage every aspect of this cult, and they really thought like everything out. You got to get all of your followers, you got to make sure you're taking care of them, you got to make sure they're worshiping you and care about you, you got to educate them, you got to indoctrinate them, you got to actually make them want to give their life to you. And while all of this might sound like some pretty scary shit, and it normally would be, it's with a bunch of cuddly, friendly animals, so it all of a sudden becomes, okay. Even when you're feeding them another animal's poop, yes, that actually happens. And speaking of cute, cuddly, and friendly, you look at the game, look at the art style, the presentation. I really love how this game looks. It looks very unique, and the music, I mean, what do you expect me to say here? The music is also pretty good. It's probably the weakest soundtrack out of all the games I'm talking about today, but even as the weakest game, I still think the soundtrack is better than most AAA games. Alright, with such a unique premise, what even is the gameplay? I'm so glad you asked. It really is a mix of two different types of gameplay. There's the cult management side of things, where it's kind of more like Animal Crossing. It's pretty chill, you're just taking care of your followers and building up your village. But there's also the dungeon crawling, where it's actually more like Hades. It's nowhere near as refined as Hades, or diverse, and there's not as many random factors, but yeah, it is a dungeon crawler in the vein of Hades. I will say between the two different gameplay styles, I actually prefer the cult management style more. I just had a lot of fun with the cult management stuff, and always found it to be pretty engaging, but the dungeon crawling is pretty decent as well. As you play through the game, your cult gets bigger and stronger. You unlock a bunch of different things for your cult members, and there's actually quite a bit of content in this game, well past the 10-hour mark. There's also been a few updates for it, there's a DLC, there's even co-op. There's a good amount of content to this game, but it all just comes together in a really unique, fun, engaging way. Like, I love managing my cult and then going off and doing a dungeon, but man, managing it is just way too much fun. There's a reason why I've put as many hours into this game as I have, because I just have a really great time with it. It's chill, it's relaxing, but at the same time, it's challenging and engaging. And I feel like the game really stands out. It stood out when it released, and here we are a few years later, and yeah, the game absolutely stands out. And so if you have yet to try it, or what I just described to you sounds interesting, I really recommend you check it out. Alright, so the next game we have here is one you've probably heard of. It is Undertale. Developed by Toby Fox, Undertale is a very, and I mean very, different type of RPG. It sees you playing as this small child who, I'll just say, ends up in another world. The world, story, characters, and world building of Undertale is exceptionally well done. It's incredibly unique, memorable, and different from just about any other type of game. Sure, it does draw a few parallels to, say, Earthbound, but I think the general world and its world building is incredibly well done. The dialogue is really great, and all of the characters are incredibly likable. There's not a bad character here. I think just about all of them are very memorable, and there's some really great interactions in this game. There's plenty of good moments and set pieces, and it was just really memorable throughout. The pacing is also very well done, and you'd hope that it is, since it is a very narrative-focused game. The narrative really is a large part of Undertale and why so many people like it. When it comes to the actual gameplay, it's a different kind of RPG. While it starts out traditional enough, where you're just walking around, exploring, interacting with characters, and getting into random encounters, when it comes to the combat, that's where things are really different. Whenever you get attacked in this game, it actually becomes a bullet hell, and you have to try to dodge their attack on the little screen down below. But when it's your turn to attack, you can attack them like normal, but you can also talk to the enemies. And talking to the enemies is sometimes more important than actually fighting them. You can learn a lot about these enemies, and I'll just say there are some very, very different ways literally every single fight can go in this game, depending on how you approach things. The game has several different endings, and a lot of outcomes can play out in completely different ways. It's an incredibly replayable game, and you'll want to replay it. and you'll want to replay it, and that's because the characters are so lovable, the gameplay is so unique, the writing is really well done, and so many different things can actually be different from playthrough to playthrough. Oh, and the music's just kind of goated. The music is like stupidly good in this game. Undertale has just a phenomenal soundtrack. The presentation is pretty basic for the most part, and I won't lie, it's probably the weakest aspect of this game, but I like it nonetheless. But the soundtrack really does go hard. I'd say Undertale really is one of the best RPGs of the 2010s, and it's a really unique experience. There's also Deltarune, but it's currently not finished, so I don't really have all that much to comment on currently. I will just say that I think the first 2 episodes are really great. Alright, and the last game to wrap things up with today is a game that I may or may not be addicted to, and that is Balatro. Yes, the poker roguelike that has taken the world by storm and had everybody pretty much addicted to it for about a year now. Balatro is one of the greatest games of the 2020s, and I really just cannot believe how good it truly is. I had heard some good things about it, but after finally playing it for myself, oh yeah, this game is just phenomenal. While it might seem a little intimidating or even unintuitive at first, after you play even 30 minutes to an hour of this game, you'll immediately understand why everybody likes it. I'd say there really are 2 people in this world. There's people that like Balatro, and then there's the people who have never played Balatro. While it starts out as just a simple poker game at first, you know, you've made a pair, 2 pair, flush, straight maybe, the game gets way crazier with these jokers. These jokers change how you play the game, and there's tons upon tons of different jokers. Then there's also a bunch of other random factors like other cards you can add to your deck, you can change up cards, there's boss fights, and yeah, there's a lot of replayability with this game. It is a roguelike after all, so you would expect a lot of replayability, but this game just takes it to the next level. And I really just can't believe how much fun this game actually is. It makes you think in completely different ways. There are just so many jokers that pretty much every run you're going to have is going to be different from the last, and you'll come up with brand new strategies that may or may not work, but when they work, oh, this game is so much fun. When the points start racking up, when you have a really good hand, man, this shit just hits. It is a ton of fun. At times, it's like too much fun. This is all I want to play. I'm out here just thinking about poker hands. I'm trying to go to sleep and I'm hearing the noises. I'm tweaking when I'm not playing it. Here we are months and months later and I'm still just going off about Balatro. This game, it is amazing. If you want to play a game that will hook you in pretty much right from the beginning, play this game. I love the aesthetic. I love the fun colors. I love the saturation, the music. There's really only like 1 or 2 songs here, but it's hella good too. And all I gotta say is it is crazy how much time I put into this game. It's crazy that this game is even on this list. It was made by just one guy. It's just a funny little poker game with the silly jester, but no, it's actually mad good. If you breathe air, check this game out. I don't even care if you don't like poker games or card games or roguelikes. Check this one out. This one is different. This one will change your mind. It is just straight up hypnotic. I really can't believe just how good it is. I beat it ages ago, but here I am still coming back to it and still talking about it a bunch because, yeah, it really is that good. It's one of the best games of this entire video, no hyperbole. Alright though, that's it for today's video. Just wanted to talk about some awesome indie games, show some indie games some love. Let me know down below some of your favorite indie games. Let me know some indie games that you would personally recommend. I'd love to know. And with that, I'm going to be saying goodbye, but before I say bye, I'm going to say strawberry, you know what to do. See you all later. Stay safe.